I had dedicated half my life to studying trenches that sunlight never touched. The vessel had been my second home, a small steel fortress floating above the endless blue abyss. This time, we were deep in the North Atlantic, so far from shipping lanes that satellite signals sometimes grew weak. That night, everything was eerily quiet. The captain, a man who had sailed for over 40 years, confessed he didn't like the atmosphere. "Too quiet," he muttered. "The ocean is holding its breath." Around 2 a.m., while I was checking data in the control room, the sky erupted. It wasn't a typical storm. It felt like an explosion of nature, driven by a wicked, angry will. The first colossal wave swallowed the entire deck, shaking the vessel like a toy. I felt my chest compress as the air pressure dropped instantly. The captain bellowed orders no one could clearly hear. Within 10 minutes, we went from operational readiness to complete despair. Water began pouring into the engine room, not in trickles, but a fierce torrent through a fresh fissure in the hull. I scrambled onto the deck, where the wind screamed loud enough to tear eardrums. Rain lashed my skin, cold and stinging. I saw the captain struggling to activate the flare gun. His face was ghostly white in a flash of lightning. "Get to the life raft," he roared, but it was too late. A gigantic black wave crashed down from the port side. I felt the ship tilt sharply, followed by a metallic shriek, the sound of total disintegration. The immense force hurled me off the deck. I barely managed to gasp one last breath before the ocean's fury engulfed me. When I surfaced, the vessel was gone. Only debris, oil slick, and enveloping darkness remained. I clung to a piece of floating wood, realizing I faced not just death, but a slow, anonymous demise in the deep. I had survived the horrific storm, only to confront a more devastating ordeal: the absolute silence and utter solitude of the ocean. The next morning, the storm had passed. The ocean was now a slick black silk reflecting the gray sky. The silence after the storm was more terrifying than its roar. I still clung to the fragment of wood, supplemented now by a leaking, overturned plastic supply barrel. I realized I was the only survivor, or at least the only one I could see. The cold had penetrated to my marrow. I was shivering uncontrollably, a warning sign of rapidly approaching hypothermia. I spent half an hour wrestling with the plastic barrel until I managed to flip it. Inside there was little. Some soaked rations, a half-empty soda bottle, and most importantly, a large survival knife. Climbing onto the precarious barrel, I maintained balance. I no longer felt like I was drifting on water, but riding a tiny, vulnerable island in an infinite void. As the sun climbed higher, I saw a body floating about 20 meters away. It was the captain, face down, his orange life vest clenched to his chest. I called his name, but there was no response. Though getting closer might have meant more supplies, I couldn't swim. Hypothermia had drained my strength, and the fear of leaving my cramped barrel was greater than the necessity. I watched him drift away, shrinking into a faint orange dot. This solitude was psychological torture. All around me was blue, blue, and blue. No clear horizon, just a circle of water and sky. I began to lose track of time. Then I looked down. The water below the barrel was impossibly deep, dark, and impenetrable. Suddenly I saw a long, dark shadow, larger than a small truck, glide beneath my feet. It wasn't fast, nor did it seem like a whale or dolphin. It was just a dark mass moving slowly, seemingly investigating. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried to suppress my breathing, making no sound. I knew that here, in its domain, I was just a small, easily shredded bait. I didn't know what it was, but the feeling that it was watching me from the depths was driving me insane. Day 3 began with the evaporation of hope. The water was gone. The meager rations were finished. The craving for fresh water became unbearable pain. My lips cracked, my throat scorched. I began to hallucinate. In my delirium, I saw the dark shadow again, closer this time. The water was clear, and I could finally make out its structure. It was not a living creature. It was a massive piece of the vessel's hull, perhaps part of the bridge or laboratory. It floated suspended just below the surface, upside down, the metal twisted and sharp. The gray metal under the deep blue water looked strangely alien, like a dead hand reaching up from the abyss. The cold was no longer painful, but a dreadful numbness. I used the knife to carve marks on the plastic barrel, one for every half day, just to keep myself tethered to reality. As I carved, I heard a different sound. Not the lapping of waves. It was a scraping, I leaned down. My floating barrel was being rubbed against by something. I looked through the clear water. The dark debris of the vessel was still there, but next to it there was another shape. This time it was definitely alive. A large shark, perhaps a mako or a smaller great white, slowly circled. It wasn't aggressive, only curious. It scraped lightly against the vessel's metal, then turned its nose toward my barrel. It had black, emotionless eyes staring at me as if I were an inert object. I knew what it was doing. It was probing, testing the durability of the nest I clung to. I gripped the knife tightly. I knew if it decided to attack, my only recourse would be one final attempt to inflict injury before it dragged me down. The shark dove a little deeper, then abruptly turned and swam away, but it didn't leave. It just circled widely, maintaining distance as if waiting for some kind of signal. The shark's appearance gave me a fierce purpose: survival through the night. Adrenaline replaced hunger and thirst. I sat on the barrel, my legs dangling in the water, knife ready. As sunset turned the sky a cruel orange and purple, I stared into the water, searching for the shark's silhouette. It had vanished. During the dense, moonless night, the ocean became a block of freezing liquid. I heard a breathing sound from beneath the water. It was loud, heavy, like the snorting of a large marine mammal. I flashed my small remaining flashlight. The weak beam cut through the darkness but wasn't enough to reveal the source of the noise. The breathing sound drew closer, and then I felt a slight bump against the plastic barrel. Not a powerful strike, just a subtle push, enough to destabilize me. I was too exhausted to scream. I closed my eyes, bracing myself. Then I felt pressure. The plastic barrel began to sink. I had clung to it too long. My weight had slowly waterlogged it. The ocean was finally reclaiming its property. I had to abandon the barrel and swim. But swim where? As the barrel sank, I thrashed, swimming away from the sinking debris. I was now entirely in the water. My body reacted to the cold water shock as if I'd been electrocuted. I swam aimlessly, just enough to keep from drowning. After a few minutes, I realized I was swimming in one direction, towards the heavy, rhythmic breathing sound. I plunged into the darkness, driven by panic and searing thirst. I didn't know if I was swimming towards death or salvation, but I couldn't stop. The most horrifying realization wasn't an unexpected attack, but the feeling of being guided, dragged along by an invisible current in the pitch black. When I was about to collapse from exhaustion, I saw it. Not a whale, not a ship. It was a large, grayish-blue object, bobbing on the surface, rising higher than my head. I panicked and tried to turn back, but I was too close. The object was a large, inflatable life raft, the kind used by large vessels, but it was flipped over. It was still buoyant, and the breathing sound I heard wasn't a sea creature, but the sound of compressed air being slowly released from the old rubber pontoon. I had stumbled upon the shore of survival. I used all my remaining strength to grab a loose rope on the bottom of the flipped raft. Flipping it over was impossible, but just clinging to it allowed me to lift my upper body out of the frigid water, escaping the immediate threat of hypothermia. I gasped for air. When I opened my eyes, the dawn had broken, and I realized I wasn't alone. A few feet away, another floating object bobbed, a small metal case, the kind used for measuring equipment. I swam toward it despite every muscle screaming in protest. I opened the case. Inside, there was no equipment, only two items: an empty emergency flare gun and a logbook wrapped in a waterproof bag. I opened the logbook. The last page read, "They came and pulled us down." It wasn't the storm. It was something sentient. Below the shaky writing was a crude drawing, a rough image of a severed ship surrounded by deep scratch marks. If they were pulled down, then who wrote this? Who survived long enough to record it? I looked out at the vast ocean. The waves were calm, yet I was gifted a truth colder than the sea. The storm may have sunk the ship, but something else, not supernatural, but the brutality of mankind, or perhaps some kind of colossal sea life, had ensured no one would survive. I tried to rationalize mass shark attack, or pirates using explosives. I settled on the latter, as it was the less insane option. I survived one more day on that overturned raft. My mind was breaking, but the logbook kept me grounded. Around mid-afternoon on the fourth day, as I began to drift into a final sleep, I smelled smoke. Diesel fuel, an artificial scent, the smell of civilization. I forced my eyes open. On the horizon, a faint black smudge appeared, moving slowly. A boat. Final strength surged through me. I pulled out the knife and began scraping the bottom of the rubber raft, hoping the sound would travel underwater and draw attention. I knew the boat was too far to hear me otherwise. I had to move. I released the flipped raft and began swimming towards the smoke plume. It required an almost suicidal effort. I swam, not by muscular strength but by sheer will, each stroke an affirmation that I would not become an anonymous corpse. As I got closer, the boat grew larger. It was a sizable fishing trawler, moving sluggishly. They didn't seem to see me. Desperate, I tried to scream. The sound was a harsh croak. Just as they were about to pass, I used my last ounce of energy to kick, lifting my head above the water, weakly waving an arm. A figure on the deck looked down. Then, a long, dry, hopeful horn blast sounded. They saw me. I don't remember being pulled aboard or being bandaged and given water. I only remember lying on the deck, looking back at the ocean, still quiet, still cruel. I survived the storm and the solitude of the abyss, but the true horror wasn't the death I avoided, but the unspoken truth of what happened in the deep. I returned, bearing a story no one could believe, a terrifying, haunting devoid of the supernatural, driven solely by the brutality of reality. I knew that even though I had left, the ocean was still holding the secret of those who were dragged below. My name is Elias Thorne. Most of my life has been spent traveling between steel and salt water, tied to deep submerged structures that sunlight never reaches. We were operating off the Barents Sea, hundreds of miles from land, in an area where it is said the seafloor holds more secrets than the cosmos. We were not ordinary divers. We crewed the Abyssos, a saturation diving vessel where pressure became atmosphere, and time was measured by decay cycles. Our mission was to repair a faulty communication relay station at a depth of 300 meters. There were 3 of us: myself, the chief engineer, Marcus, a seasoned but taciturn mechanic, and Finn, the young assistant, on his first assignment lasting more than 72 hours in a hyperbaric environment. Inside the Abyssos, the air was thick with ozone and sweat. The external pressure compressed the hull, creating a persistent humming sound, like the buzzing of 1,000 insects. Isolation was a given. Once locked into the diving chamber, we had cut off almost all contact with the outside world, save for a fragile, intermittent satellite line. On the very first day, while checking the auxiliary gas supply valve systems, our last resort, our ultimate lifeline, I sensed a problem. If the main gas supply failed, this unit had to activate instantly. Following protocol, I used a wrench to check the tightness of the valves. Everything seemed perfect, but when I shone my light onto the emergency pressure gauge, a small crack appeared. It wasn't a crack from corrosion or normal stress. It looked as if it had been struck by a sharp tool, as if someone had deliberately weakened the protective glass. I called Marcus over. He stood staring at the crack for a long time, his eyes empty. He simply shrugged and said, "The sea is old, Elias. Everything breaks." Finn panicked. "Can it withstand the pressure?" "It can," I said, but a sense of unease crept into my mind. Someone had done this, or it had happened during transit. But whatever it was, the risk had increased tenfold. I noted it in the log and applied reinforcing tape, trying to dismiss the feeling that this mishap was more than just a mechanical failure. The crack seemed too intentional. That evening, Marcus ate his dinner in silence, staring intently at the manometer, as if it were a countdown clock to death. I knew a seasoned vessel always had fatal flaws, but this was a perfectly maintained ship. That crack was a warning, a cipher I couldn't yet decode. This feeling wasn't like being at sea. It was like being trapped in a tightening vice. The isolation began to heavily affect Finn's psyche. He was already volatile. At this depth, every sound, every minor change in the air was amplified. Marcus, conversely, grew increasingly quiet. He spent hours just observing the pipes, occasionally muttering indistinctly to himself. On the second day, we began compressing helium into the chamber, the most perilous phase, as our bodies had to adapt to the external pressure. Helium distorted our voices into high-pitched squeaks, but more crucially, it started affecting perception. Around midnight, while I was reviewing the operation logs, The main oxygen filtration system suddenly ceased functioning. The glaring red alarm light flashed and I felt the air thinning within seconds. "Damn it!" I yelled, my voice helium-pitched. "Marcus, the filtration system." Marcus was asleep in the adjacent bunk. He shot up, reacting disturbingly slower than usual. We had to work in the near darkness, illuminated only by a weak green emergency light. Finn and I frantically checked the valves. Finally, Marcus found the issue. A filter component was clogged by a foreign object, not residue or salt, but a piece of synthetic cloth wedged into it. "How could that?" Finn stammered. "It was inspected before the chamber was sealed." Marcus pulled the cloth out. "Maintenance error," he said curtly, avoiding eye contact. I did not believe him. For this cloth to get into the system, it had to have been inserted after we sealed the chamber, in an area requiring specialized dismantling skills. Only Marcus or I would know how to do that quickly and discreetly. I hadn't done it. I pulled up Marcus's maintenance log for the filtration system. His numbers and handwriting looked normal, but the final inspection date on the paper had been crossed out and rewritten with a different ink. It appeared to have been changed just hours ago. Suspicion flared within me, burning as intensely as the pressure outside. Marcus wasn't just making mistakes. He was concealing something. I glanced at him, sitting silently, hands resting on his knees, as if listening to a conversation only he could hear. That feeling was more terrifying than any great white shark, being locked in a flimsy metal box 300 meters underwater, while the only person you could trust seemed to be systematically and slowly trying to kill you. By the third day, we had reached the target depth. We prepared for the dive to commence repairs. Finn and I would enter the smaller diving bell and go outside. Marcus remained aboard the Abyssos, responsible for operating the gas supply system, monitoring communications, and controlling the mooring mechanism. Before entering the diving bell, I tucked my diving knife into my jacket pocket. I didn't know what I might use it for, but I knew that if something went wrong, it wouldn't be a machine fault. The diving chamber was cramped and metal cold. As the diving bell began its descent, the sounds of the Abyssos gradually faded, replaced by the chilling sound of surrounding seawater. Finn and I looked at each other through our helmet visors. Suddenly, the signal transmission cut out. "Marcus, check the main line," I said, trying to maintain composure. There was only static and screeching. After a few minutes of deadly silence, Marcus's helium-distorted voice returned, but it was garbled, full of static, and unintelligible. I only caught a few words. Pressure, unstable, fog, wait. Fog? We were 300 meters down. There was no fog, only darkness and water. Immediately afterward, I felt a powerful jolt. The mooring system was being retracted. We couldn't begin work. "Marcus, what are you doing?" "Stop retracting the moorings." There was no reply. The diving bell started moving, but neither up nor down. It was being dragged horizontally, as if the Abyssos was moving away from its fixed position. Marcus was steering the vessel away from the safety point. If he continued to drag us, the gas supply and communication lines would snap. Finn began to panic, wildly kicking the side of the diving bell. "We're being dragged. He wants us to drown." I attempted to adjust the emergency pressure valve to increase the diving bell's weight, hoping this would force the Abyssos to stop. But when I removed the control panel, I discovered something horrifying. The manual balance control system had been disabled. The crucial ballast vent valve had been removed. In the location where the valve should have been, there was only a small piece of paper, tightly taped to the metal wall. The paper was soaked and crumpled, but Marcus's handwriting was clear. Dense fog. "Wait in silence. This was not an accident. This was attempted murder." We were being dragged into the darkness, and at this depth, death would arrive before we could even scream. Finn's fear morphed into hysteria. He slammed his head against the visor, screaming. At this depth and pressure, panic could instantly lead to a stroke or decompression sickness. He was no longer a reliable partner. While Finn struggled, I focused on the control panel. Marcus had locked the automatic pressure system. We were descending far deeper than planned, and if the dragging continued, we would be permanently trapped in an underwater fissure. I had to find a way to sever our connection to the Abyssos, the mooring lines, the gas lines, and the electrical cables. I grabbed the diving knife. Just then, Finn violently pulled my arm. He stared out into the endless darkness. His helium-pitched voice was almost a shriek. "He's there, Elias. He's watching us." There was nothing but water. No one. The pressure and the helium were causing his mind to collapse. I elbowed Finn away. I began slicing the electrical cables. Each cut required enormous strength, and the pressure in my chest was agonizing. I knew that if I cut the gas line, we would only have a few hours to survive on the diving bell's tiny reserve tanks. But it was our only chance to escape Marcus's control. As the blade severed the third cable, the diving bell violently shook. The jolt was so strong I thought we had struck rock. No, I looked up. The main mooring line was tightened, then suddenly released. Marcus was playing games. I worked frantically. As the final cable was cut, a stream of icy water poured into the diving compartment through the tiny crack on the pressure gauge I had noticed on the first day. Finn wailed in pain and panic. He collapsed. I had to forget about Finn. The diving bell was now free. I activated the emergency controls, pumping gas into the small ballast tanks, using every last bit of power from the reserve batteries. The speed had to be precise. If we ascended too fast, decompression sickness would tear us apart from the inside. If too slow, oxygen would run out before we reached the surface. I felt as if an invisible hand was trying to crush me. It wasn't hallucination. It was nitrogen narcosis, distorting everything into an inexplicable horror. I thought I saw Marcus's shadow standing outside the viewport, wearing a diving suit, staring at me. But I knew that was impossible. I forced myself to look at the numbers. Depth, speed. I had to adhere to the discipline blindly. It was the only way to defeat the madness brought on by pressure. Every meter upward was an ordeal. I suffered from a terrible headache. The blood vessels in my eyes felt ready to burst. I knew I was in the danger zone for severe decompression sickness, but I chose survival at any cost over certain death at the bottom of the sea. After nearly 2 hours of endurance, the first pale light filtered through the diving bell's viewport. The sea transitioned from black to deep blue, then turquoise, and finally, the gray hue of the Arctic sun. I was stunned when the diving bell suddenly collided with something. It was the abysses. I was back where I started, but the submersible had drifted tens of nautical miles from its original anchor point. I activated the final ballast blow mechanism and broke the surface. Opening the diving bell's hatch, I gasped for the cold, unfiltered air. It tasted salty and sharp. I looked down at Finn. He lay motionless. I swam toward the abyssos. The vessel was eerily silent. There was no engine noise, no indicator lights except the automatic ones. I climbed onto the deck. The ship was completely deserted. I checked the control cabin, where Marcus should have been. The seat was empty. On the main panel, all systems had been manually shut down. I found a second piece of paper, placed on the radio control panel, also in Marcus's handwriting. I saw it. Down there. Can't be fixed. They need silence. He was gone. Perhaps he used the small lifeboat, or perhaps he jumped into the sea in a fit of madness. The psychological crisis caused by isolation had pushed Marcus past the brink of reality, making him believe that something needed the silence of the deep, and he had to eliminate us to achieve it. I used the emergency radio to call for rescue, reporting a severe mechanical and psychological failure. A few hours later, a patrol vessel arrived. They towed the abyssos and took me aboard. When the rescue team asked what had happened, I recounted the story of system failure, communication issues, and Marcus's panic. I omitted the detail about the crack on the gauge in the second note. I survived. My body required an extended decompression period and recovery from severe decompression sickness. I knew the psychological scars would take much longer to heal. I had faced the ocean, but the real threat came from inside the vessel, from the man I trusted. They found the abyssos' small lifeboat a few days later, adrift and empty. Marcus had merged with the silence he sought. Everyone says the sea is the greatest threat, but I learned the truth. The most frightening thing is what happens to the human mind when confined in the darkness, where isolation becomes an unbreakable, cold wall, and reality slowly melts away. I am Ethan. Typically, people think of the ocean as a vast space, But when you are 500 nautical miles offshore in a small research submersible, it narrows into a terrifying, isolated bubble. My mission, a well-funded private project, was to map a previously uncharted oceanic trench, an area I jokingly called the living black hole. Everyone else was incredibly far away, and I had virtually no responsibility other than keeping the Triton afloat. It was midnight, and the Triton was hovering at 300 meters. I was organizing sonar data when the uneasy feeling started to creep in. The silence was the most frightening thing. There was only the sound of my own breathing apparatus, the faint whirring of the fan, and the occasional soft thump of weak currents against the hull. I was used to these sounds. They were the rhythm of the deep, but tonight there was another sound. It wasn't a thump. It was a vibration, a low, powerful frequency, felt more through the bone than heard through the ear. I checked the instrumentation. Passive sonar was detecting a massive object, moving very slowly at a depth of roughly 800 meters, well below my position. It was too large to be a whale or a colossal squid, and it moved too steadily. Scientific curiosity is often an explorer's poison. I should have simply logged the coordinates and reported back. I knew that. But I had spent months searching for something undocumented, and my gut told me this was it. It felt like standing before a closed door and being compelled to open it. I engaged the thrusters, beginning my descent. The external pressure mounted, and the faint moonlight had long since disappeared. Nothing remained but absolute darkness. The submersible sank deeper and deeper, yet the mysterious object remained static. It was waiting for something, and I was about to find out what. As I descended, the pressure became a physical, heavy entity pressing on the hull. I strained my eyes against the sonar display, trying to define the object's shape. At 750 meters, I activated my powerful searchlights. What I saw was not a reef or an ancient wreck. It was a massive artificial structure, a rig or perhaps a research station, but built of pitch-black, light-absorbing material, clearly designed to be completely invisible to any standard radar system. This area was strictly off-limits to any drilling or research activity. This was protected international water. My initial panic wasn't about being detected, but about the sheer illogical existence of this structure. Who built it, and why was it hidden so meticulously? I maneuvered the submersible closer, attempting to capture photographic evidence. Just as I was operating the camera, a warning light on the dashboard flashed. Satellite communication lost. My isolation had become a trap. I attempted a frantic radio call, but only received chilling static in return. Someone, the operators of this structure, had realized my presence and swiftly cut off all communication. I felt frozen in place, a kind of total paralysis, not of the body, but of the will. I went into silent running mode, shut down the searchlights, and began to turn the sub around. The abyss returned to total darkness, but I couldn't feel any safer. I knew the people operating below were acutely aware of my presence. In that instant, a massive black shape slid past the observation port above. It made no sound, showed up only faintly on the sonar, just a sheer block of matter that completely obscured the artificial light still emanating from my navigation beacons. It was a massive submarine, designed for absolute stealth, moving slowly right above the secret station. These people weren't just exploiting resources. They were guarding a deadly secret, and they knew I had seen it. There was no more time for fear or doubt. I had to get out of this depth. I accelerated to maximum speed, launching the Triton toward the surface. I didn't need to look outside to know I was being pursued. The low-frequency vibration I had detected earlier was now distinct and closer, transmitting directly through the hull. I mentally ran through the worst-case scenario, based on what I had witnessed. This was a highly organized group, capable of advanced stealth technology, and certainly willing to eliminate any witness. At 400 meters, an abrupt, sharp noise resonated through the hull. Like a steel punch wrapped in velvet, it rattled the entire sub violently. I stumbled, struggling to grip the controls. The warning lights started flashing maniacally. Not the communication light this time. This was auxiliary thruster system malfunction. They hadn't used a torpedo. They used something far more sophisticated. an electromagnetic pulse or a sophisticated underwater jamming device designed to fry sensitive electronics, effectively crippling the sub remotely. The ruthlessness and efficiency of it sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to switch to the backup thrusters, but they were running at half power. My ascent rate dropped sharply. I had lost my advantage. The chase became intensely suspenseful. The sub above didn't need to close the distance. They just needed to maintain range and continue to degrade my systems. I was so focused on fixing the engine failure that I almost forgot about the external pressure. A small, almost inaudible hiss came from the rear. I spun around. A blinding red warning light flashed immediately. Pressure warning, hull compromise. A tiny, almost invisible fissure was slowly spreading across the outer shell near the auxiliary engine compartment. Though slow, water was beginning to seep into the compartment. At this depth, a small crack could rapidly turn into catastrophe. The hull was breached, and somewhere in the vast blackness, my hunters knew exactly where I was. I couldn't continue the ascent. With damaged thrusters and a leaking hull, I was forced to engage the emergency purge system to keep the submersible from sinking deeper. I was playing a dangerous gamble. If I stayed at this depth too long, the pressure would crush me inevitably. If I ascended too quickly, the damaged hull might implode. I grabbed the signal pistol, something never to be used unless surfacing in a critical emergency, and checked my rescue wetsuit. My body was coiled tight, anticipating a danger more tangible than a stealth submarine. After several agonizing minutes, I realized the submarine above had stopped. The vibration had vanished. Perhaps they assumed I was crippled and would slowly sink. But I knew better. This silence was a tactic. I shined my navigation lights around. The sea was pitch black, but just a few feet from the observation port, I saw the silhouette of a floating object, not debris. It was a person, a diver, equipped in a sealed suit with no telltale air bubbles, proving he was using an advanced rebreather system. He was no shark, but he was far more terrifying. He swam to the flank of my sub near the small fissure and began attaching a device, undoubtedly an explosive charge or a hull-breaching device controlled remotely. In this isolated environment, this was a deadly duel I had no chance of winning in a conventional way. I couldn't unlock the hatch to confront him. The decision had to be made in a fraction of a second. I had to use the submersible itself as a weapon. I quickly engaged the left auxiliary thruster at maximum power. The Triton lurched violently sideways. The diver tried to hold on, but he couldn't fight the sudden propulsion in the deep water. I repeated the action, then abruptly reversed the thrust direction. The diver was tossed violently between the water currents, forced to let go of the device he was attaching. A moment later, he was slammed directly into one of my already damaged thruster propellers, the sharp blade still turning sluggishly. I watched through the port as he vanished into the dark depths. His sabotage device floated weightlessly for a moment, then began to sink. The silence returned once again, but it brought no relief. I was still adrift in enemy territory, and those controlling the sub above had just lost a man. They would be enraged. The fight was over, but this victory was temporary. The enemy was still up there, and I was slowly sinking. I knew they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. They would send more men, or simply use a stronger jamming device to finish the job. I had to act immediately, while they were busy processing the diver's failure. I had no choice but to ditch non-essential equipment. I purged the main ballast tanks immediately and jettisoned all scientific data. The weight reduction was significant. With my crippled backup thrusters, I pushed the speed to maximum, hoping the unexpected rate of ascent would create a window of opportunity. The hull breach was worsening. Water was ankle-deep in the auxiliary compartment. I sealed the isolation door. Now it was solely a race against time, against the pressure and against my ruthless predators. I had to reach the surface before the submarine above could react effectively. I launched the Triton upward, pushing it past the safe operating speed. Every meter gained was an agony for the damaged hull. I felt my chest tighten, not from the pressure, but from the realization that if I were caught, the worst would happen. 100 meters deep. I began to see a faint dark blue light 100 meters deep. The light became clearer, a hopeful beacon after absolute despair. Finally, I breached the surface. The Triton shot up, rocking violently on the high waves. I unlocked the upper hatch, taking a gasping breath of the cold sea air. I immediately shone the floodlights across the horizon. The stealth submarine was gone, or perhaps maintaining a distance too great to be seen in the dark. I had survived. I immediately activated the manual emergency beacon, a device they couldn't possibly cut off. As my trembling voice connected with the rescue team, I felt no sense of relief. I looked out at the dark, vast ocean. I had seen what humans do to keep a secret. I knew that although I had escaped, I carried a heavy burden. The ocean was no longer a place of science or exploration. It was a hiding place for a dangerous criminal enterprise. I had escaped that black hole, but the haunting memory of what I saw and the men who tried to end me would stay with me forever.